Hello, I'm Mark Skinner. I was born at a time before cryoprecipitate was discovered, and the only treatment available was whole blood and fresh frozen plasma. I've experienced the full range of treatment advances, as well as suffered the tragedies from the lifetime living with severe hemophilia. For almost 40 years, I've lived with HIV and have a history of hepatitis. While treatment products are remarkably safe today, we remain ever vigilant. The lack of early access to effective treatment led to significant joint disease, necessitating over a dozen orthopedic surgeries. While I'm grateful for medical advances, our work is far from done. We're a resilient community, but certainly we have not yet achieved a normal or equivalent life to those living without a bleeding disorder. Significant unmet need remains. There's a paradox of our accepting chronic pain, joint disease, and limitations in life as normal. We need treatments that are fully responsive to what matters to patients, outcomes that encompass the whole cycle of life, the ability to go to school, get an education, have a career and family, as well as participate in the activities of daily living and sport, unimpeded by our hemophilia, to live life spontaneously without thinking about or the burden and worry of a bleed or resulting pain. We're in an era of patient empowerment, where patients and their families are in control, and where their care team can use shared decision-making to agree and achieve individual patients' life goals and aspirations without constraint. Surrogate endpoints that are not aligned with day-to-day living care are not enough. To achieve health equity, we must realize that decision-making requires more than a single number, the number of times I've bled in a year. It should encompass a holistic approach to treating the individual as a whole person. Health equity encompasses a shared vision by providers and patients alike, tracking clinical and patient-centric outcomes in parallel, such that the value is not limited to efficacy endpoints alone, but rather provides a clear path towards normal hemostasis. We as patients will be critical and essential partners in achieving this vision of ameliorating inequities caused by the disease and allow us to achieve the unimaginable, health equity. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Norman Faust as our first plenary speaker. Dr. Faust is a pediatrician, medical ethicist, and professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have known Dr. Faust since 1982 when I was an undergraduate at Wisconsin and took my first medical ethics course from him and Professor Dan Wickler. Dr. Faust tells me his medical ethics course is the longest continually taught course at Wisconsin, and I'm not surprised because Dr. Faust is one of the best teachers I have ever had. Since I spent a total of 11 years at the University of Wisconsin getting my undergraduate, graduate, and medical degrees, I had the pleasure of attending multiple other seminars and lectures given by Dr. Faust. When I started my medical school clinical rotations in pediatrics, I was lucky to be surrounded by many great clinical and research mentors in the Department of Pediatrics, including giants such as Dr. Faust, Dr. Aaron Friedman, Dr. Mary Katcher, Dr. Paul Sandal, Dr. Nasser Shahidi, and our own Dr. Diane Nugent. I've been fortunate enough to stay in intermittent contact with Dr. Faust all these years. And just as importantly, I've continued to consume everything he has written. I actually have my Google Scholar alert set to let me know whenever Dr. Faust publishes anything new. And even though he retired in 2015, he continues to write fascinating and thought-provoking papers. When we were brainstorming about potential plenary speakers and considering someone to discuss the ethical implications of new therapies, including gene therapy for hemophilia, I could not imagine a more perfect speaker than Dr. Faust. I am so pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Faust as our first plenary speaker today, but even more pleased to introduce him to all the attendees who can now learn from him and appreciate his brilliant mind. Dr. Faust, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks to Michael Recht for inviting me to be part of this conference. When Michael called me, he asked me if I would give a talk on ethical issues on research involving patients with clotting disorders. which sounded a little bit like the famous exam question, discuss the universe and give 2 examples. So I asked him if he would survey his colleagues to get a more detailed list of the particular ethical issues that you're interested in hearing about, which he did. And I got an incredibly detailed and robust response, pages and pages. So I organized those into 6 general topics and focusing my comments today on these 6 topics, and particularly on what I consider to be shibboleths about these topics. And I'll make clear what that means in just a minute. In 1300 BC, after the inhabitants of Gilead inflicted a military defeat upon the tribe of Ephraim, the surviving Ephraimites tried to cross the Jordan River back into their home territory, and the Gileadites secured the river's fords to stop them. In order to identify these refugees, the Gileadites put each refugee to a simple test. Whenever an Ephraimite fugitive said, "Let me cross," the men of Gilead would ask, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he said no, they said, "Well, very well, say Shibboleth." Pronunciation of the Hebrew word Shibboleth was used to distinguish Ephraimites, whose dialect lacked the SH phoneme, as in shoe, from the Gileadites, whose dialect did include such a phoneme. So if anyone said Sibboleth instead of Shibboleth because he could not pronounce it, they would seize him and kill him by the fords of the Jordan. And it is reported that 42,000 Ephraimites fell on this occasion. So the word shibboleth has come to mean an idea, opinion, or saying that is commonly believed and repeated, but that may be seen as old-fashioned or untrue. That is a sort of a cliche word, a password, if you will, that people use in ethical discussions that's almost always meaningless or perhaps oversimplified. So I'm going to be discussing 6 what I consider to be shibboleths in this area of research ethics as it applies to patients with clotting disorders. So the 6 shibboleths that I'll be talking about are, first, the belief that the traditional activity of signing a consent form has something to do with obtaining consent. This will be more clear as we go on. Second, a belief that healthcare should be shared equally. There should be equal access to effective healthcare. Third, that scarce resources, if they can't be provided to everybody, that they should be distributed randomly. Fourth, that the way these issues should be decided is through some democratic process, that we should use some sort of democratic procedures to decide health policy issues. Fifth, that gene therapy raises unique ethical issues different from other kinds of biomedical research. And last, concerns about the financial concerns of industry and a belief that these are incompatible with the ethics of patient care. So let's start with this consent issue. So there's I think a widespread view that to obtain consent means to get somebody to sign a consent form. That's not really the case. The word consent literally means to think with. So to get consent from somebody is to get him or her into a situation where he or she is thinking with the investigator. As Paul Ramsey put it, where they are, the investigator and the subject are joint adventurers embarking on this project together. Well, of course, a layperson patient can never be at the level of the investigator in understanding what is being proposed, but the idea is it's an ideal to be pursued and one should asymptotically try to approach that ideal. Well, consent, of course, is meaningless if it's not informed. The word consent is always preceded by the word informed. It's informed consent. And the word informed means understanding, at least understanding basic key elements of what's being proposed. You can't buy a pig in a poke, meaning if the pig's in some sort of a container where you can't examine it, can't make a meaningful decision to purchase it. A signature on a consent form provides no information on whether the signer understands anything. I don't mean it provides inadequate information. I mean it provides zero information. A signature doesn't tell us anything about whether the person, the signee, has read the form or understands it in any meaningful sense. To find out whether there's really significant understanding requires what we call a 2-part consent form, in which part 1 is the information part that you're familiar with, and part 2 is some assessment of the subject's understanding, either written or oral. The consent form, as we know it, is really a legal document whose purpose is to protect the physician or the institution from a lawsuit. In fact, law in this area, including the federal regulations, the common rule that governs human subjects research, that's all it requires. It's just getting a signature to protect yourself against a lawsuit. There is no legal requirement to obtain ethically meaningful consent, that is, consent which we have some reason to believe the subject understands in some meaningful way. So we have this tension between the legal notion of consent as it's usually practiced and the moral form of consent, which would involve understanding and some documentation of that. Well, suppose you take this seriously and give the patient a quiz, written or oral, and discover that he or she doesn't really understand what it is that's being proposed. They flunk even a very simple consent test. If it's non-therapeutic research that's going on, I think you should seriously consider excluding the subject. We're talking about studies that by definition have no conceivable benefit. So the subject would not be foregoing anything of any real medical benefit to him or her. If it's an important clinical trial with a prospect of direct medical benefit, and which there's reason to want to help the subject join it if they want to, the alternatives are to try harder, to realize that your first attempt to get him or her to understand it didn't work very well. Maybe let a different person take a crack at it. Somebody, a different type of health professional, might have better luck than you did. Or to even to consider non-human decision aids such as interactive computer programs. I've done some research in this area related to genetic screening, and there's a large literature on it. And I can tell you that interactive computer programs, properly designed, almost always do better than humans in getting patients or prospective research subjects to understand what's going on. The second shibboleth is this notion that healthcare should be distributed equally, that if everybody should have equal access to known, effective, beneficial healthcare. With regard to research, we should be clear that we're talking and distinguishing between research projects and proven effective healthcare. With regard to research, I think the concern that a patient can't access a research therapy is not of any great moral significance. That is, by definition, research involves a sub-collection of the population. That is, we don't do research on the entire population. So by definition, research always means that large numbers of patients will be excluded from the research project. And we don't think there's entitlement to be in a research project. And secondly, research by definition has no known value, or at least uncertain value. The benefits and risks are really unknown. That's why we're doing the research. If we were confident about the benefits and the risks, we shouldn't be doing a research study. And these studies obviously necessarily include only a small sample of the population. Moreover, even the notion, even when you're doing beneficial research with the prospect of clinical benefit to the patient, it's important to realize that 95% of these clinical trials fail. That is, there is a huge financial filter that weeds out bad ideas in clinical research. The average clinical trial costs something like $500 million with a B, $500 million. That trial may not cost $500 million, but to go through all the previous steps of animal studies, laboratory studies, to get a product that is ready for human trials, by the time you get to human trials, it costs roughly $500 million to complete human trial for any one intervention. Despite that huge financial filter, 95% of trials that get to human subjects, the human subjects phase, the phase 1, 2, or 3 human subject trials, 95% of them fail. That is, even though there's a tremendous filter for bad ideas, you don't want to spend your money or other people's money on bad ideas. 95% of them turn out to be, if not bad ideas, ideas that just don't pan out. That's an FDA statistic. This rate is probably even higher in genetic research, but we don't have good numbers. So my colleague and friend David Demetz, who's an iconic figure in the history of biostatistics and particularly ethical issues in clinical research and clinical design, has said to me several times, Norm, if I'm unconscious, if you find out I'm unconscious and I'm in the emergency department and there's a research project going on, I want to be in the study and I want to be in the control group. What Dave was referring to is this famous inclusion benefit of research trials. That is, just being in a research trial means you get better care. People in any arm of a research trial do better than people who are getting the same intervention outside of a research trial. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But generally, it's in your interest to be in a research trial, and he wanted to be in the control group because he knows that 95% of people in the intervention group are going to get adverse effects with no benefits. The intervention is almost certainly not going to work. So being in the control group gives you the benefit, the inclusion benefit, without undergoing the risks of the intervention. So finally, in a country that doesn't even recognize a right to basic health care, it's hard to argue that there's an entitlement to be in a research project or to receive a research intervention. The next shibboleth has to do with this notion that when we have completed a study and we have some new innovative intervention that we have reason to believe is safe and effective because of clinical trials, that these products should be distributed equally. That is, everybody in society should have equal access to proven effective treatments. And I call this a shibboleth that is an oversimplification or a somewhat meaningless plea for a number of reasons. First of all, proven effective treatments can't be distributed equally, particularly in the area of genetic research. The costs of new genetic therapies are extraordinary. I mean, now approaching $1 million a year per patient for some interventions. And those costs, it's just not possible to provide everything of any known medical benefit to everyone who wants it. That is, rationing is unavoidable in all countries, including this wealthiest of all countries. It's not just healthcare that's rationed, other necessities of life are rationed. We can't distribute, there's nothing, hardly anything that we can distribute equally. Food, shelter, clothing, and education, all arguably necessities of life. We want everybody to have some of those, but we can't distribute them equally. Not everybody can have the best food or the best shelter or the best clothing or the best education. And if we're going to insist on equal distribution of these things of value, that can only be achieved by reducing benefits or eliminating them to get down to some least common denominator. So we don't want to, almost no one wants to live in a world that says if everyone can't go to Harvard, no one can go to Harvard. Or if everyone can't go to the University of Wisconsin, then nobody can. That's not a defensible principle. To tie this to healthcare, in any department of surgery, there's inevitably going to be some surgeons who are better than others, and one who's probably the best in terms of measurable outcomes. And everyone can't be operated on by the objectively best surgeon. We don't want to say that, well, if everybody can't get the best care, then nobody should get care in that department. So the commitment shouldn't be to everyone getting the same healthcare or the best healthcare. The commitment should be at the least to a decent minimum of healthcare, not all beneficial healthcare. What constitutes the decent minimum is more than we have time for, but there's good work on ways of defining that in a meaningful way. And so which brings us to the next question, which is how to decide what's in the decent minimum, or how to decide how to distribute healthcare when everybody can't get it. So I want to turn to that question. And a common shibboleth in this area is that when there's scarce resource, when there's some, let's say, very expensive new drug or genetic intervention, and it can't be, we can't afford to give it to everybody, that it should be provided randomly. And that's a little bit problematic, and it's a little bit complicated to explain why that's not a good idea. I'm going to do it by using a game, if you will, that philosophers play to illustrate this point of why random distribution of a scarce commodity, whether it's a ventilator or ECMO or gene therapy or the best surgeon, why random distribution may not be a good idea. So if you'll play along with me here for a minute, imagine that you have 100 patients with some fatal disease. They're all going to die. And there's a pill that cures this disease. But you just have 50 pills. You don't have enough for everybody. And you have 100 patients. And the question is, oh, they're all going to die without treatment. And assume, furthermore, that half of these patients require only one pill to be cured, and half of them require 2 pills. And the question is, what's the right way or the fair way or the best way to distribute these pills? Well, here's plan A. Let's assume we know who's who are the 1 pill patients and who are the 2 pill patients. Plan A would propose giving all the pills to the 1 pill patients. We have 50 pills, there's 50 1 pill patients, and we can save 50 lives that way. This seems very efficient, but the problem with it is it seems unfair to the 2 pill patients, and they will certainly think it's unfair. And particularly if the way you get in these categories has something to do with genetics, which you have nothing to do with and is not your fault. And if these genetic distribution of susceptibilities and benefits have some racial biases built in with them, it will be especially problematic to be giving all the pills to the 1 pill patients. And certainly the 2 pill patients will believe with some force that this is unfair. So let's consider plan B. How about if we just give 1 pill to everybody distributed by lottery? That is to take one version of this proposal to distribute scarce resources randomly. So if we give these pills, just 1 pill to random members of this population of 100 people, 25 pills we have 50 pills, and if we distribute them randomly, 25 will go to the 1 pill patients and they'll all live. So that's 25 lives saved. But 25 pills will go to the 2 pill patients, and that will save 0 lives. So that seems like really a terrible waste. We're just throwing these pills down the toilet. So this form of a random distribution does not seem very sensible. It's clearly inefficient and involves a rather remarkable amount of waste. The net lives saved by this plan is 25, only half as many as plan A, but plan A had its own problems. So what about plan C? Which is another form of random distribution or lottery in which we give people what they need, but we select them in a random way. That is, suppose we pick 1 person out of this group of 100 by lottery and find out whether he or she's a 1 pill or a 2 pill person and give them what they need. Well, in this approach, half of the lottery winners will need 2 pills, but will only really save 12.5 lives because half of them will need 1 pill, and that will lead to 25 lives saved in 25 pills. But the remaining 25 pills will go to people who need 2 pills, and therefore only 12.5 of them statistically will benefit. So this scheme will save 37.5 lives. The actual number is 33, 34 to 34. We don't need to go into that minor difference. So here in this proposal, we're saving roughly 37 lives, which is better than 25, but not as good as 50. So we really have to decide what the goal is here. Is the goal to save the most number of lives, or is the goal to be fair? That is, there's a tension here between efficiency, between an approach that will save the most number of lives that seems and feels unfair to the 2 pill patients, especially if their status is genetically determined, or if their status, that is their need for 2 pills, is determined by previous inequalities based on poverty or lack of health care or race. If that's how you wound up being a 2 pill person, having them be disadvantaged in the lottery will seem to be aggravating what's already an unfair system. So which method of distributing pills you decide on depends on whether or not you know your status and whether we care about fairness and not just efficiency. So another shibboleth, which is that we should always save the most number of lives, is problematic. So in conclusion, random distribution is not self-evidently a good idea. It depends in part on what form of randomization you use. And efficiency, saving the most number of lives, is also not a great idea because it competes with basic notions of fairness and certainly what a large percent of the population would consider to be unfair. So if there's any conclusion here, it's complicated, but the point is that just saying we should distribute scarce resources randomly is not a satisfactory approach. The next shibboleth on my list is this notion that in asking how we should decide these questions, when we have this uncertainty and these disagreements about how to distribute these resources, some people are comfortable saying that, well, it ought to be done in a democratic way, or using a democratic process. It shouldn't be just doctors or just politicians who decide. The general public should be involved in this in some democratic way. And I just want to identify some of the problems with this point of view. I'm going to illustrate this by a situation I found myself in March of 2020 at the very onset of the COVID epidemic, when New York was drowning in COVID cases. I mean, 1,000 deaths a day and running out of ventilators. And you all will remember this huge debate between President Trump and Governor Cuomo about who was responsible for providing ventilators. I was called by the Wisconsin, essentially the Secretary of Health, Department of the Secretary of Health Services, one of her surrogates, and was asked to form a committee to write guidelines for the state of Wisconsin on how its 150 hospitals or so should allocate ventilators. That is, Wisconsin doctors and hospitals were terrified that the New York situation was going to arrive at our doorstep in a week or two. And they wanted guidelines on how to, if there were a shortage of ventilators or ECMO or dialysis machines, how to distribute them. What guidelines should there be? Well, it was amazing how quickly we were able to reach agreement. And it was a multidisciplinary, multi-ethnic committee. And we were able quickly to agree on sort of 10 basic principles of allocating scarce resources. For example, the notion of saving the most number of lives, which seemed first to be of great appeal, we agreed that that was not a good idea, because saving the most number of lives would aggravate previous inequalities. Poor people are less likely to survive a COVID illness and less likely to survive long-term. And if we're trying to save the most number of lives or the most number of life years, they're going to now be disadvantaged again after a lifetime of being disadvantaged. So we were able to agree on things like that. But the one we had the most trouble with, there were two issues, but one of them was on whether and how to implement these so-called democratic principles. It was unanimous that there should be public engagement, that the public should be as involved as possible with the development of policy. But there was a lot of uncertainty about just what this meant in practical terms. That is, how exactly to engage the public in some democratic way. Well, here's some of the alternatives. One simple one would be to ask the legislature what they thought. They're a democratically elected body. But the problem, as you all know, is the legislature is not remotely representative of the people they're supposed to be representing. And in Wisconsin, this is especially egregious. In Wisconsin, the Democrats in multiple elections, including the most recent ones, win 53% of the votes statewide, but only get roughly 1/3 of the seats in the legislature. So the legislature doesn't even reflect the will of the people who are voting in the election, which is not all the people. Just to take another famous example of our national legislature, ever since Gallup began polling on gun control 80 years ago, it's always been the case that 90% of the country or thereabouts wants gun control, and it never happens. As the legislature is completely out of touch with the overwhelming majority of the country. So the legislature is just not a good place to look for democratic principles that are representative of what the people want. But what about asking so-called community leaders? Well, first, that forces you to decide what communities. Well, there's some that quickly come to mind: African American, Native American, Latinx, male, female, LGBTQ, elderly, disabled. There are a lot of communities. So what communities wind up on that list is one problem. But second, how do we define even those communities? There's not one Black community in Wisconsin, or one Native American community, or Latinx, or disability communities. That these communities are incredibly heterogeneous, with people of widely disparate views and different community leaders. I mean, just defining Latinx involves classifying people in some cases by the language they speak, Spanish, or the country they come from, or their cultural practices. So people from Spain, Mexico, or Cuba might all be Latinx by some definitions, but they're obviously very dissimilar in their views about things. And just defining who is an African American, who is a disabled person, these are all incredibly complex. But even if we can agree on that, even if there's some crystal clear answer of where's the Black community, or who's who is the Black community. There's the problem of who's the representative who's going to speak for those communities. We can't talk to everybody in that community, even if it's one community. So who gets to speak for them? Well, that depends in part on who shows up to meetings, and that in part depends on where the announcements are of the meetings and where's the meeting being held and what kind of a meeting is it? Is it an in-person meeting, an online meeting? What time of day is it? So obtaining broad community input by resorting to leaders of these communities is ineffective and can be misleading. Is there some way of going directly to the people to get broad community input? Well, one can do surveys with problems of, what kind of surveys, what mechanism? Is it a phone survey? Is it cell phone based? Is it email based? Is it web based? And what people have access to that? We can put out a public plea or request for letters, email, text, or phone calls. And again, we won't get a representative sample. And finally, and most importantly, even if we have a completely perfect way of finding out what the public wants and it's unanimous, that if we have a crystal clear picture of what the public wants, it's not clear that the public knows what's in their own interest, medically or in any other way. There's, just to take some current examples in the news, as you all know, there's an enormous state variation in just views on whether the COVID vaccine is a good idea or a bad idea, or whether hydroxychloroquine for COVID pneumonia is a good idea or a bad idea. So the role of community opinion, even if it's unequivocal, is really uncertain in a world in which a large percentage of the American population thinks the vaccine is a bad idea and that hydroxychloroquine is a tremendously good idea. So the public just often is dazed and confused. The role of community opinion, finally, there's questions about what to do, even if these opinions are clear and unequivocal. That is, do we want community opinion to be controlling? Do we want to subject these sorts of questions about how to distribute scarce resources to a referendum and do however the vote comes out? Well, I mean, what if the vote's 51-49? Or what if the vote's 100-0 that chloroquine is better than COVID vaccine? So you don't want community committee to be controlling. So is it just simply advisory? Well, that seems closer to what's practical, but that can involve problems of raising expectations, which are then dashed. That is, you're asking the community for their opinion. They state their opinion, even if it's unequivocal, you don't follow it because we doctors know more than the people do. So we just ignore the opinion if we think it's a bad idea. So this whole idea of using democratic principles to get input on health policy decisions is very complicated, and it cannot be reduced to a simple shibboleth like, well, the people should decide. In conclusion, democratic principles, which were created historically for a political system, where they don't work very well either, but as the saying goes, maybe it's better than whatever other options there are. But whatever their virtues for a political system, they really seem inappropriate for complex healthcare decisions. Community engagement is essential. Almost everyone agrees to that, but it's difficult to define. And it certainly should not be equated with giving the community the authority to make decisions. Next, I want to turn to gene therapy. Several of you in your comments had concerns about the ethics of gene therapy, which have been widely debated since gene therapy has been with us, which is not all that long. And I just want to make a couple points to address the shibboleth that there's something unique or special about gene therapy that requires special scrutiny. First, we need to acknowledge that the use of genetic technology to alter the human condition is widely accepted. I mean, we obviously use gene products like insulin. We do genetic screening is increasingly a routine part of medicine. We do genetic counseling to help people select their mates and offspring. We use genetically selected transplants, and gene therapy now is increasingly accepted. So the notion that there's something especially problematic about genetic technologies is not consistent with widely accepted views. So if we accept the fact that at least some forms of gene therapy are okay, we don't want to have a ban on gene therapy. And gene therapy falls into these two large categories of somatic cell versus germ cell therapy. Somatic cell therapy, it seems to me, is not qualitatively different from any other somatic interventions, drugs, devices, surgery. That is, anytime we fool around with people's bodies with some new idea, there are unknown benefits and risks, and they need to be assessed in well-designed scientific studies. And the design of these studies is very important. Oversight by institutional review boards, high standards of informed consent, which we've talked about. All these are important with any kind of technology when we're messing with the soma, with the human body. And genetic therapies, I don't think, are qualitatively any different than other kinds of interventions. What about germline interventions? That is, interventions on an embryo using CRISPR or other technologies. The common concerns that are raised about this sort of technology include the following. First, that this involves playing God. Well, true enough, but it's hard to know what God's plan is. I mean, whether God wants us to do this or doesn't want us to do this, it's hard to get data on that. And the problem is that all of medicine involves playing God, if by playing God we mean interfering with nature or God's plan. Everything doctors do is interfering with the natural order of things. If God intended for people to have cancer, it would be an odd position to say, well, we shouldn't interfere with that plan. As Ian Wilmot, the inventor of cloning Dolly the sheep, put it, God put scientists on the earth for a purpose, including Ian Wilmot, and if God didn't intend for Ian Wilmot to develop cloning, why did he put him on the earth? So the playing God card is, it's a little hard to know where that leads. Another concern is interfering with a child's right to an open future. When we interfere or meddle with a child's genome before he or she is born, that we're interfering with his so-called right to an open future. Well, first of all, it's not clear that a future dominated by a fatal disabling illness such as hemophilia is an open future. That is, by treating children with hemophilia, we surely do interfere with their right to an open future if that right includes having this terrible and otherwise fatal illness. So what's wrong with interfering with the child's open future if that open future includes something that's a fatal or disabling illness? We interfere with the future of children all the time. When we treat them with a serious illness, we're interfering with their future in a way that we think is better for them in the long run. And the fact that the child can't consent to this is beside the point. We rely on appropriate surrogates who care about the child and can be trusted to act in the child's best interest, and societal oversight to mitigate inappropriate sort of interventions which shouldn't even be offered to parents. And parents sometimes make bad decisions or wrong decisions and that fall in the category of abuse or neglect, and we have societal mechanisms for interfering with parental decisions when we think they're behaving or deciding badly. Some people think there's a distinction between treatment and enhancement. It's not clear that there is any meaningful distinction. One example that's used, if you imagine an imaginary planet called Asthmatica, where everybody wheezes all the time, and somebody introduces albuterol into this planet, is this treatment or enhancement? Well, is asthma a disease? If it's a disease, then it's treatment. But if asthma is the normal condition on that planet, then it would seem that albuterol is an enhancement. We're enhancing the well-being of every single person on the planet. But the question is, so what? Who cares whether you call it a treatment or enhancement? But the only thing we should care about in that example is whether it's safe and effective, and obviously have some concern about costs as well. So whether something's treatment or enhancement, or whether there's a meaningful difference, may not be important. Even if something's clearly enhancement, so what? Enhancement is an absolutely central daily human activity. We try to enhance our children's cognitive abilities through education. We enhance athletes' abilities through sports training. We send our kids to Suzuki lessons and Kaplan courses. That is, normal parenting involves constant efforts to enhance the child's opportunities in the world. It's a widely accepted part of healthcare. We give immunizations to perfectly healthy children and adults to enhance a perfectly normal immune system. It's not thought to be morally problematic. So the morally relevant issue is not whether something is treatment or enhancement, as I said, but whether it is safe, effective, reasonably affordable, and problems of access. What about the effect on future generations if germ therapy goes awry, if it has bad side effects and has effects on treating and affecting future generations? Well, as I mentioned, anytime we treat a child with a life-threatening disorder, we're affecting the genetic makeup of future generations. That is, by treating children with hemophilia, we're increasing the incidence of hemophilia in the next generation. If we just let everybody with hemophilia die out, there'd be much less hemophilia in the world, but that's not thought consistent with what the general goals of medicine. By treating these children, we obviously increase the likelihood of them procreating, and we're interfering with natural selection. But again, it's sort of, so what? Genetic counseling affects the genetic makeup of subsequent generations. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis affects future generations and is widely accepted. That is, I think it's reasonable to assume that a future possible child would prefer to be born with a normal clotting system if we have an intervention that we know is safe and effective in producing a normal clotting system. And the fact that it's affecting dozens of future generations, it's not clear why that's problematic if we think that that's what children would almost certainly want. We do need societal oversight to reduce the, I left the word out, possibility here, to reduce the possibility of projects that are very problematic with regard to risk or benefit. So there needs to be oversight of these endeavors. Just some recent examples of the fact that this oversight seems to be working. 5 years ago or so, a South Korean investigator attempted to clone a human being and was thought to be a bad idea by almost everybody. And he was subject to criminal penalties and I think was acted as a deterrent. And more recently, a Chinese investigator who used CRISPR to change HIV susceptibility genes in a human embryo, again, bypassing widely accepted principles of oversight, IRB review, and so on, necessity, widely criticized and punished, and I believe criminal charges were brought against him or two. So there are crazy ideas out there, ideas that are tried before their time, and we do need oversight and regulation. Finally, some of you raised questions about the conflicts with industry and healthcare professionals and the clashes between the financial goals of industry versus the more benevolent or beneficent goals of healthcare professionals. So let me just make a few comments of that to try to penetrate a few shibboleths in this area. As Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, the business of business is business. That is, the goal of industry is not the promotion of health or the prevention of disease. The goal of industry is profits, to return investments. It's not just their goal, it's their obligation. People give them money, whether it's venture capitalists or individual investors, and the job of the head of the industry is to return that investment, to return a profit. Corporations vary in how much societal obligations they feel, but certainly all corporate leaders can see their first obligation as maintaining the integrity of the corporation, having to be financially solvent and making money. Well, is this so different from the goals of medicine? The goals of medicine are less clear than they used to be. Paul Starr, 30 years ago, wrote about the transformation of American medicine from a Norman Rockwell sort of vision to an organization that's really increasingly controlled by corporations, hospitals, insurance companies, and pharmaceutical companies that are not very distinguishable from car companies and widget factories, that is, whose preoccupation is mainly profit. And the individual physicians who work for these corporations have mixed motives. Just one example of this, as a member of our conflict of interest committee at my medical school said when we were trying to set some limits to excessive outside income, this individual said, quote, if the university is going to limit my income to $600,000, I will need to seek employment elsewhere. So he was a person who I know cares deeply about his patients, but he also cared a lot about his income. As it says in Ecclesiastes, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So physicians profit not just from being doctors and getting paid in the upper few percentiles of American wage earners. They try to increase their profit sometimes from selling drugs in their office or making money off of X-ray machines in their office. And we know from numerous studies that these sorts of added ways of doctors making money can often lead to inappropriate prescribing or testing. Physicians are frequently hired by large pharmaceutical companies to teach and write, and they are more likely to convey inaccurate information when they're paid by that source. 3 consecutive editors of the New England Journal of Medicine, Arnold Relman, Jerome Kassir, and Marcy Angel, when they retired as editors of the journal, they each wrote a book on their own. They could write on any topic they want. And guess what? All 3 of them wrote on the corruption of American medicine by the pharmaceutical industry. They all saw this as the #1 problem facing America. And I highly recommend of those 3, all of them, but the clearest one on this problem is by Dr. Angel, her book, The Truth About Drug Companies, and the way in which drug companies control the American healthcare system through the design of clinical trials, the things that they choose to study, the ghostwriting of scientific publications and editorials, lecture fees, lobbying, and so on. There's been over $10 billion of criminal penalties against the top pharma companies, not against any individuals, but against corporations. Doesn't seem to change their behavior very much at all. Big Pharma subsidizes an outfit called the Washington Legal Foundation, whose mission is to protect the pharmaceutical industry from excess regulation by the FDA and the Accreditation Committee on Medical Education. Their goal is to ensure that physicians with financial ties are not prohibited from participating in CME. And on their website, they state, quote, "It is widely acknowledged that most of the top authorities and virtually all of the top speakers are employed in some capacity by one of the country's pharmaceutical companies. That is how it should be," end quote. So the shibboleth here is the notion is that there's some distinction between industry and medicine. It's increasingly difficult. As another one of my colleagues, an endowed professor, said when he was asked to comment publicly about the fees he was getting for ghostwritten editorials, that is, editorials written by a pharmaceutical company, which he would sign in exchange for a fee. He said in writing, "Obviously, I like to get paid. I like to have money. They have meetings sometimes in pretty nice places. I love that. That's great. I really hope I don't allow those relatively trivial and material things to get in the way of science. That would be awful." So physicians do profit in all sorts of ways. Clotting disorders is a particularly interesting example because it's my understanding that experts in clotting disorders have been able to retain profits from selling clotting factors in the office. My understanding is that in general, this money does not go to the physicians for their own personal profit, but goes to improve patient care services. So it actually may be a good example of physicians, quote, profiting from in-office sales. Disclosure of conflicts of interest is not a solution. In fact, it may have a paradoxical effect by making the listener more trusting. There are studies showing just exactly that when a speaker discloses his or her conflicts, that the audience comes to be more trusting of him or her because they believe he is honest. So telling your wife, "Honey, I'm having an affair," does not justify the affair. Disclosure does not affect the underlying conflict and the adverse effect of decisions that affect the well-being of patients. It's naive to expect others to be motivated by altruism when it's becoming a bit of a problem in the medical profession. So I think each healthcare professional, doctor, nurse, resident, has to be alert to these conflicts, the mixed motivations of physicians, and has to monitor his or her own involvement. Well, I hope these comments were not too distressing. If so, you could only agree with the famous ethicist who said, the famous person who said, if all the ethicists in the world were laid end to end, it would be a good thing. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Welcome to the State of the Science Summit, presenting to you research priorities for hemophilia A and B and the results from Working Group 1. My name is Annette Vondrickalski. I'm a professor of clinical medicine and the director of the Hemophilia and Thrombosis Treatment Center at the University of California, San Diego. I'm caring for adult patients with hemophilia and bleeding disorders, and therefore my research interests are inherent to the evolution and pathobiology of hemophilic arthropathy, as well as issues of the aging patient, such as cardiovascular disease. Dr. Tran.
Thank you very much. My name is Bobby Tran, and I'm an assistant professor at the Hemophilia of Georgia Center for Bleeding and Clotting Disorders of Emory at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm an adult hematologist, and my research interest lies in exploring patient health outcomes, particularly those in persons with hemophilia.
And here's the agenda for today. We provide to you an introduction, process and timelines, results, summary, and of course, looking forward to a lively discussion. First, the introduction. Hemophilia has become a lifelong disease with many unanswered questions, and there clearly is a need to study and elucidate questions arising over the lifespan to improve outcomes and care. Towards that, it is important to understand history and perhaps the past 6 decades, which are a therapeutic revolution. And this therapeutic revolution is directly related to the increase of the lifespan of a patient with hemophilia with a median of 11 years in 1960s to now near normal. So in the 1960s, bleeding required hospital admission and treatment with whole blood transfusion. Then in the 1970s, intermediate purity factor, a concentrate such as cryoprecipitate, became available for home infusion. But in the 1980s, most patients with hemophilia had been infected via these blood products with hepatitis B, C, as well as HIV. And really sadly, most had died rapidly. In the 1990s, the Ryan-White Care Act came to fruition and provided funding for HIV care. Ryan had hemophilia and AIDS, and this little boy spoke in front of Congress and fought for his rights to attend school while his parents' house was burned down. He died as a teenager, so truly dark times. Then high purity factor concentrates with new viral inactivation steps were developed, and in 1992, the first recombinant factor product came to market. So during the last decade, remarkable progress has been made, encompassing introduction of the first prolonged half-life concentrates and factor-free treatments. And this decade is truly devoted to continue this effort with perhaps more factorless options and gene therapy on the horizon. So with that in mind, it is understandable that there are many open questions for aging persons with hemophilia. And it is clear that there needs to be lifelong bleed control, no question, and that will always be central to the disease. However, while young patients are transitioning from childhood to adulthood, more problems and questions arise inherent to the management of arthropathy, cardiovascular care, hypertension, bone health, health literacy, and socioeconomics. We simply didn't have to think about that maybe 20 or 30 years ago, but now we do. And with that, Dr. Tran.
So Dr. Vondrickalski and I were tasked with co-chairing Working Group 1 to develop research priorities for persons with hemophilia A and B. Additionally, 5 other working groups were also identified, and some of the anticipated research priorities for Working Group 1 would also overlap between those in working groups 4, 5, and 6, requiring a degree of collaboration with these other working groups. Next slide. For our working group, these general topics arose from the initial discussion with multiple stakeholders, as NHF previously discussed. Our working group was tasked with dissecting and addressing not only these topics, but also additional topics affecting persons with hemophilia A and B by formulating a catalog of research priorities for these individuals. We emulated this template into various subgroups, which covered basic, translational, and clinical research priorities. Next. The development of Working Group 1 started in early 2001. Next. Dr. Vondrickalski and I were identified first in February of 2021. Soon after, we worked with NHF to recruit members of the working group, which included many different stakeholders. After the first few initial meetings as a larger working group, because of everyone's busy conflicting schedules and time zones, we actually divided ourselves into subgroups early on. We still met and gave reports to the larger Working Group 1 every 2 weeks, but the majority of the subgroups met weekly until the completion of developing the research priority questions for persons with hemophilia. Next. The members of the working group, as demonstrated here, were composed of a multidisciplinary panel with a broad representation of different stakeholders, including patients, chapter representatives, social workers, physical therapists, nurses, mid-level providers, pediatric and adult physicians, expert leaders, and also industry. This team provided experiences and advice from multiple different perspectives over a broad range of topics. Next. After initial discussion as a larger working group, 7 subgroups were formed to address the research priorities for individuals with hemophilia A and B. There was one lead member who not only led the subgroup meetings, but also reported back to the larger working group 1 in order to gain further input of different topics. Many of the working group members were in several of the different subgroups, which also allowed for overlap discussion if needed. These subgroups worked diligently and met most weekly to not only explore and discuss research priorities, but also develop interesting research questions within these broad topics. Next. Each of the subgroups formulated somewhere around 10 research questions of interest. With some guidance from NHF, we standardized our approach to these questions and were rated and scored by feasibility, impact, and risk. The questions were initially scored by the subgroup members first, and any grossly disparate results were reconciled and discussed. And then the results were presented to the larger working group. Here we had open discussion and input were obtained from all members of Working Group 1. We must emphasize that the questions developed are all important and should be addressed in some fashion in the future despite the score. Next. Using the rating method, the possible scores ranged anywhere from -10, which reflected low feasibility, low impact, and high risk, all the way to 28, which reflected high feasibility, high impact, and low risk. We divided the scores into 3 segments with low, medium, and high priorities. With those questions with scores of 16 and above falling into high priorities based on the current infrastructure and expertise available. These scores may change in the future as infrastructure and expertise availability change. Next.
And now we proceed to results. As Dr. Tran already mentioned, we would like to emphasize that every question listed on the next 7 slides is important, but may not have risen to the top, for instance, above or equal the score of 16, inherent to factors such as feasibility or a lack of infrastructure. Also, several questions which overlap with other working groups are not discussed here, but will be addressed by the respective working groups in a more fitting way. So with that, we start with subgroup 1, and subgroup 1 addressed arthropathy, pain, and bone health. 9 important questions were formulated and 5 rows above or equal 16. So the first question was, what medical or rehabilitative mechanisms-based measures facilitate optimal blood or iron clearance from the joint? Second, what is the optimal post-hemarthrosis rehabilitation protocol? For instance, joint aspiration, weight bearing, or the so-called police protocol? Is there a role for post-surgical interventions to reduce osteochondral and soft tissue changes? What is the role of thrombin generation in maintaining bone and joint health? And what are the effects of bone strengthening agents such as biphosphonates, vitamin D, or chondroitin on hemophilic joint health? Questions 6 to 9 address pain quantification and treatment, the incorporation of ultrasound into daily practice, the role of regenerative medicine, and the type of surgeries or interventions to mitigate arthropathy. Subgroup 2 addressed inhibitors. 5 questions were formulated and almost all rose to a score of equal, above, or 16. The first priority reads as follows. What are the education needs for patients or families and trainees or providers in the non-factor replacement era? What can predict inhibitor development in hemophilia A was a second priority. Third, what are predictors of inhibitor development and allergic reactions in hemophilia B and predictors of response to tolerance? And then number 4, and lastly, what is the optimal initial exposure and ITI strategy in the non-factor replacement era? And number 5, which didn't quite make it into the red box, but equally important, what is the role for gene therapy for tolerance? These questions, as you can see, bear high relevance for inhibitor prediction, prevention, and management. And in this context, it is also important to point towards the recent scientific national blueprint issued by the NHLBI, focusing on all scientific aspects regarding factor VIII inhibitors, i.e. basic, translational, and clinical science. In combination with this effort here at NHF, this should provide a really informed roadmap forward. Now we come to diagnostics. Subgroup 3 address diagnostics related to laboratory assessments as well as imaging techniques. As you can see, 13 questions were formulated and 6 rose to equal or above 16. Of note, this subgroup, rather than formulating questions, this group formulated their priorities as items to be done or accomplished. Also of note, while only 4 of the 13 research priorities related to imaging techniques, and here primarily ultrasound for musculoskeletal syndromes, 3 of those quote-unquote imaging questions rose to the top into the red box, whereas the other 3 items were more related to the necessity to identify rapid and solid tests regarding bleed diagnosis and prediction. So let's read those 6 items. First, develop validated home patient self-imaging techniques, demonstrate the value of patient self-imaging to improve management, establish a biomarker profile that can predict bleeding phenotype, and develop a site-specific, like joint, muscle, or brain, blood test for rapid subclinical and clinical bleed detection. Study the genotype, genetic or other modifiers, protein expression patterns in plasma and tissue in relation to bleeding phenotype. And then develop fast and quantitative MRI sequences to assess bleed burden and iron accumulation objectively. Research priorities involving lab tests such as global assays to universally assess hemostasis potential and measure bleed risk, clotting factor activity levels in relation to bleeding, impact of routine clinical and imaging assessments on outcomes, anti-drug antibody occurrence in the setting of non-factor therapies, companion tests, and specific to hemophilia B, bleeding risk based on factor IX tissue distribution stayed below the quote-unquote 16 line. Dr. Tran.
So subgroup 4 addressed the topic of gene therapy within hemophilia population. This subgroup developed 16 questions and 9 rose to equal or above the score of 16, as highlighted by the red box. Interestingly, when we rated these research questions, the questions divided themselves into 3 distinct categories as identified by the different shades of gray. The patient-centered questions, represented by questions 1 through 6, received the highest priority. How does the status of health literacy on hemophilia and gene therapy, as well as psychosocial and clinical well-being, and educational interventions influence decisions making, compliance, psychosocial changes, and other clinical outcomes after gene therapy. Priority number 2, how can knowledge and empowerment of patients be built to allow pathways of advocacy to help build health equity? What types of methodologies can be created and will be successful to provide health equity, affordability, and fairness for all stakeholders, including society as a whole? And priority number 4, what are the most appropriate education and consenting methods for gene therapy for minors? Priority number 5, what types of operational methodologies can be developed and will be successful and appropriately adjustable to the local or specific needs? And then priority number 6, what patient-related factors influence factor-level outcomes and how? The more scientific questions, as represented in questions 7 through 12, fell mostly into high or medium priority, with 3 of them falling into and receiving a score of 16. And these questions included what modifications of vectors and dosing and administration will reliably lead to normal and durable factor levels and can reduce immunogenicity. Also, what is safety, efficacy in lentivirus-mediated gene therapy as a possibility to provide durable factor expression, as well as an option for younger children? And is AAV antibody removal feasible and effective to allow successful AAV vector transduction? The safety and comorbidity questions, as represented in questions 13 through 16, were ranked the lowest, but these questions were also associated with the higher risk. Gene therapy remains a big step forward for persons with hemophilia, and we feel that whether questions were patient-centered or scientific, these questions will need to be addressed in the future to provide our patients with hemophilia proper care when receiving this exciting new therapy. Next slide, please. Subgroup 5 addressed transition within the hemophilia population. As we all know, hemophilia is a lifelong bleeding disorder and has multiple transitions associated with this disorder. This subgroup addressed the research priorities of transition for persons with hemophilia. We specifically discussed that transition should be incorporated not only the physical transfer of care, but also medical independence. We recognize there are several transition tools available, but these need to be updated and should incorporate specific metrics for girls and women with hemophilia, patients with different severities, parents and caregivers, and also medical providers. Additionally, these metrics should incorporate ongoing assessments well into adulthood. 9 questions were formulated and 6 rose to the top. Because transition encompasses physical, emotional, and social factors, the top research priority was what is the definition of successful transition and what specific metrics can be utilized at the HCC and non-HCC locations. Another research priority that rose to the top was what are the best educational tools to facilitate medical independence. The remainder of the research priority questions are based on defining successful transition. Next slide. When we began this process discussing health disparities and health literacy within the hemophilia population, we recognized that some of the questions that we were trying to develop were not necessarily limited to persons with hemophilia, but rather overlapped with other inherited bleeding disorders. We included the questions that were raised by our subgroups here, but did not rate them. They are boxed in by the red. These topics included clinical trial access, HCC staffing and funding, and different bleeding disorders associated with unique cultural populations. Other health disparities overlapping topics that were discussed, but no specific questions were developed, included transgender issues and health literacy, which we believed would affect the entire spectrum of inherited bleeding disorders and did not affect only persons with hemophilia A and B, and would therefore be addressed later by another working group. Next slide. For subgroup 6 of health disparities research priorities affecting persons with hemophilia, one research priority rose to the top. What is the difference in comprehensive care visit and attendance between males and females with mild hemophilia? We recognize more females are being diagnosed with hemophilia and would like to explore how does their care at an HCC differ from that of a male with similar factor levels. Priorities that were close to the cutoff we placed included number 2, which read, what factors do providers use to consider for girls or women the diagnosis of either mild hemophilia versus hemophilia carrier? The associated diagnosis could impact access to and insurance coverage of factor replacement. The third priority that was closely rated but did not make the threshold was number 3, where we asked, do patients with hemophilia who have a physical therapist with more full-time equivalent hours in their HCC, PT availability in their local community, or musculoskeletal ultrasound at their HCC have better functional outcomes and pain outcomes after joint bleeds? This question addressed specifically persons with hemophilia, but could be expanded to patients with other bleeding disorders who would benefit from PT access. For further health disparity research priorities discussion, please join us for the discussion later from Working Group 5. Next.
And with that, we come to subgroup 7, cardiovascular disease. Subgroup 7 addressed issues surrounding the management of cardiovascular disease, which is an increasingly important field in the aging with only anecdotal information and expert opinions available based on little data. So regarding dealings with conditions such as anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation, management of acute myocardial infarctions or coronary disease, to name a few. This field is of utmost importance for adult hemophilia care, especially with non-factor therapies on the rise. 6 priorities were formulated and 5 rose to the top. So let's read them. First, how does hypertension relate to hemorrhagic stroke and mortality in hemophilia? What is the role of non-factor therapy, at the moment emicizumab, but perhaps others in the future, in the management of atrial fibrillation with DOACs? DOAC stands for direct oral anticoagulants. What is the prevalence of cardiovascular risk factors, especially hypertension, in different hemophilia severity and age groups? How can we optimize anticoagulation management in the setting of atrial fibrillation or even dual antiplatelet agents, including lab monitoring? And then what is the role of those non-factor therapies in the management with stents after, for example, myocardial infarction with antiplatelet agents? So especially number 1 has been inspired by the growing body of data and knowledge that hypertension and blood pressures in persons with hemophilia are higher than in a general male population, whereby the reasons are poorly understood. Since patients with hemophilia have an exorbitantly high risk to die from hemorrhagic stroke compared to age-matched males, it is understandable while question number 1 and perhaps also question number 3 by the same token were deemed so important and luckily appeared to be feasible to be addressed with a high interest from all stakeholders. And then a second theme related to optimization in the setting of non-factor therapies, or let's say perhaps the advantage of non-factor therapies, providing sort of a steady state procoagulant milieu to facilitate the possibility of safer anticoagulation in hemophilia patients. Now, by the same token, while number 6 got a bit left behind in terms of what is the pathophysiology of hypertension in hemophilia, while almost reaching the red box, It is just not as easy to answer since it might involve, at least in part, basic science and lab bench work in animal models. Dr. Tran.
So in summary, the development and grading of the research priorities for persons with hemophilia was an innovative, involved, and very informative process, which spanned over 6 months of intense discussions. Broad multidisciplinary representation of different stakeholders included not only HTC staff, which included social workers, physical therapists, nurses, mid-level providers, and physicians, but also included patients, family members, chapter representatives, expert leaders, and industry to facilitate multiple perspectives to develop these priorities. The evolution of research question refinement and scoring outcome were often surprising and very eye-opening. We look forward to continued efforts and work to address and bridge these identified gaps of knowledge. Next slide. And with that, I want to thank very much all the participants and the stakeholders for their enthusiasm, time, commitment, and energy. And we look forward to a very lively discussion. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much and goodbye.